With our world in an accelerated mode of transformation, cities today need to reform the way we define our environment and how we live together. To create better cities, we often look at physical objects to create positive and negative space, to define our private and public areas. But it's not good enough. Our company is a leading experience design firm. I'm happy to share with you why we believe design is so essential to successful living, and also to share some insights. The talk today is about designing better. And change is one of the most fundamentally difficult things for people to do. The problem for most people is what to do in a time where your environment around you is changing, when the world around you is changing. I believe now the need to design better systems for living is at hand, and to define a better system for urban living is particularly a challenge. To design better, much of what we need to do is focus away from object creation and look at new ways of thinking, feeling, and doing things. I've gathered some key points, and none of them have to do with urban objects and have everything to do with urban living. The first Great Plague killed 50% of the world's population. It returned 800 years later in Europe and claimed over 200 million lives. The next Great Plague that hit London, 100,000 people died. Almost 25% of the population of the city died in 7 months, from 1665 to 66. 6% of Chicago's inhabitants died in a cholera pandemic in 1854. And the cholera pandemic in London and other locations led to hundreds of thousands of deaths. But that experience led to improvements in urban sanitation and a better understanding of how to protect drinking water from contamination. Each pandemic was an influence and an incentive to improve our understanding of the science and to redesign better ways to deal with public health and the way we live. I would argue today it's an opportunity to leverage the experience that we're having and use that in a way to frame the next ways we design how we live and how we interact with each other. Thomas Friedman, New York Times author, talks about this age of acceleration. He talks about 3 different points that are critical to understanding what's happening to the world around us. The first one is Moore's law, the exponential change of technology. The second one is the natural environment. And the third is in our relationships with one another. And these changes are growing at ever increasing speed. And if our world is about anything, it's that we're all experiencing radical disruption across a range of what have traditionally been incremental or slow changes in human experience. And with this change comes the opportunity to fix many of the things that our current design for living and working fail to address. In a world of exponential change, we have this also occurring condition of extraordinary opportunity. And the rate of change is becoming something that is starting to exceed the speed in which we can adopt and adapt to that change. And so if you think about the curve of rate of change against the curve of our ability to deal with it, we're reaching a condition that we probably have never experienced before in the history of humankind. It's recognizing that things are changing faster than our ability to understand them and to respond to them. And COVID came and made it faster. So when we look at opportunities, and specifically relative to cities, it's an interesting condition. Some people have declared cities like New York dead, notably not Jerry Seinfeld, but many are concerned about the exodus from urban centers today, and they should be. Cities today have an opportunity, and I would say a responsibility, to look at reforming how we live and work. In this work from home world, the experience has taught us that many people are recognizing that they spend long hours moving between work and home, and that it's an incredible waste of time, of money, and energy. and that they also understand that in working long hours in small confined spaces is stressful and difficult. It's why nations use solitary confinement as the greatest form of punishment for our worst criminals. John Gaper in Financial Times talks about enduring attraction of cities, and I would prefer to think of this attraction as being the richness of experience that cities offer, of diversity, of choice, of possibilities, and most importantly, of human interaction. Ben Wilson of Metropolis suggests that we decamped to the city for good reasons 5,000 years ago, for the proximity to opportunities, sociability, and sensual pleasures that cities offer. So when we think about what is at the core value that cities offer, we need to understand that this is an opportunity to evolve. It's been historically part of the problem has been our limited thinking. It's been Industrial Revolution era thinking. We went from having long lines in factories to long lines in cubicles in the workspace. And I would argue that a fundamental shift needs to occur to redefine how we think about design. We used to think of cities as a function of isolated architecture with isolated functions. Today, we need to think of it more as a platform for living. Almost everything in nature is connected to an ecosystem. Today, we need to continuously change and adapt in a process that's called dynamic stability. We have to design organizational flexibility within the city, within the ways we live. And if you think about it, we've been operating in an outdated operating system. It's fragmented, it's linear, it's task-oriented. We've been living in a DOS-based system. The operating system for today is multiple forms of input, multiple forms of expression, different forms of connectivity with disparate applications. Today, we need an operating system that works off of a dynamic stability platform. And this is a big challenge for urban planners, for urban designers and architects, real estate developers, people who live, work, and use cities to understand what are the opportunities for more successful ways to work, play, and live in urban spaces. Not just workspace, but new hybrid living. We need to think about a more agile and flexible platform for living. It means flexible in functions and in modes. And our belief is that we need to start with focusing on human outcomes. Design cities for people first. To create better cities, we often look at the physical objects, creating positive and negative space to define our private and public areas. Today's architectural education and practice appears to fundamentally lack a focus on the human outcome. It's much more about the form of the object. Maya Angelou says that people forget what you said, people forget what you did, but people don't forget how you made them feel. And today, to design better, we must change design and define the ultimate focus away from object creation to new ways of thinking and feeling and doing things. For us, this means the sequence in how we think about this problem is important. That if we understand human outcomes are fundamentally behind the most successful businesses, the most successful engagements, then we need to develop what those outcomes are, understand what we're designing to achieve, form a strategy that delivers that, and then ultimately develop tactics that reinforce the strategy that delivers those outcomes. And so this framework is ultimately essential to success. And being successful to success means creating value, not just economic value, but all forms of value. And most companies compete to create value. Business success is dependent on value creation. There are those companies who create value and there are those who extract value. But the ones who survive and the ones who are the most meaningful are the ones who create value that is delivering on successful human experience by creating positive human outcomes. Great experience are things that matter to people delivered in ways that matter to people. To compete successfully, companies must understand their relationship to people in ways that allow them to maximize their potential, and I would argue that cities are no different. And people that successfully deliver this create a competitive advantage. And for us, we call this return on experience. So the question is how? How do we go about this? And actually asking the right questions is part of the answer. When we think about framing these questions, we should start by asking some very simple things. In order for the benefit to be valuable, the experience has to be focused on people. Then the question is, are we effectively satisfying our need or desire at a reasonable cost? Whether the benefit is convenience, hospitality, distinguishing yourself from others, each one of these experience elements leads to questions that you need to ask yourself if you're creating a successful design outcome. And so designing human experience, what does that mean? We worked for many years with Steve Jobs when he was at Apple, and one of the key things he taught us is that design is not just how something looks and feels, but it is what it does for people. This is the basis for the hypothesis of creating successful outcomes. He knew that if he did that in technology, he would be able to create a successful and compelling company. We also have to understand that designing human experience means the human part needs to be understood. We need to think of people as complex emotional creatures rather than demographics and psychographics. We need to understand people from the way that something that inspires them, something that motivates them, these intangible qualities that are hard to quantify, but essential to creating successful outcomes. And the third part is then focusing on the experience that generates. Experience creates connections. Many companies will spend time focusing on conveying information, but it's not information, but experience that drives behavior. So if you're looking to generate successful behavior with people, it's recognizing the experience that you design, the experience you create is where you derive the most value. And I'd like to share this video. This is Lee Clow. He just retired last year from TBWA, and he created this video for everybody left in the company to think about as they developed new approaches to new problems.
Don't do the right thing. God knows you'll be tempted. The right thing sounds so good in meetings. It looks fantastic in charts. The right thing soothes racing pulses and settles churning stomachs. Everybody can get on board with the right thing. The right thing is good enough. But good enough is not enough. Don't do it. Don't do the right thing. Avoid it like the plague. So what are you supposed to do? The wrong thing? Of course not. Do the brave thing. The thing that troubles your sleep. The thing with a million unknowns. That seems ridiculous one moment and genius the next. That's the thing you should do. Chase it down. Don't let it go. Do the thing that disrupts, that upends, that doesn't just defy the status quo, but reshapes it forever. You can do that. You have that in you. To do the right thing or not is a choice. To disrupt or not is a choice. Let's do the brave thing.
And so when we look at a summary of this idea, the secret to creating value, ultimately to human value, is to understand that it's rooted in the definition of better human experience. Thank you.
Tim, thank you for that amazing presentation. Let me roll off the conversation with hopefully an easy question. You referred to exponential change We've generally seen, and I mean over the years, over the decades, human tendency, some would say our animal brain instinct, to react rather to respond. I almost wonder if we've created, accidentally perhaps, reactionary cities and not responsive ones. What would human experience in a responsive city feel like, the ones that I think you're referring to in your presentation? How do we really grow awareness and capacity to respond and not to react?
Well, I think, the idea of exponential change is fundamentally recognition of acceleration. And if you look historically at any species, human or otherwise, their ability to adapt to changes in their niche, in their environment, has led to their survival, and the ones who haven't adapted has led to their demise. So I think fundamentally you have to recognize that we're in a condition of change, but that change is going faster. And I think it tends to naturally create hesitation, because when people see change happening so fast, it's hard to predict what the next thing is, so you do nothing. And that's probably something that's highly risky. So, to me it means changing a bit more of the mindset, whether it's reacting or whether it's anticipating and experimenting. I think you want to open the opportunities up to let creativity, let new ideas be tried, and to see what can come from that. I don't think it hurts to take an approach to, during a time of rapid change, take an approach that is much more familiar to, say, creative industries, where people are fundamentally always approached with a problem and are paid to create new ideas and to develop new solutions that lead to better outcomes.
Thank you. You said in there that evolution, obviously, as we all know it, requires continuous change. Mm-hmm. And I almost wonder if the world is moving into an urban situation. More than 50% of the world is now urban. I think at last count, 55% of the world now lives in cities. And if that's the direction we're headed in, do you think we're actually moving towards our death? I know we ultimately are in the long run, as someone famous said. But do you think cities are actually solutions for humanity, or do you see us going back to a life that we've left behind, a rural life, or do you think cities are here to stay?
Well, I think the unfortunate thing is the way cities have been designed has been somewhat outside of the recognition of the value of nature, of local food production, of organic ingredients. The types of things that have been sacrificed historically in cities are the kinds of things that probably need to be addressed in whatever the redesign or the reformation of cities is. The idea that we've created complex transportation systems, very expensive and time-consuming ways of getting from point A to point B, means that there's something that's being offered in our residence that's not being fulfilled in our workspace, and vice versa. And I think it means that we need to introduce more natural elements and the things that remind us as much about our fundamental existence on the planet as it does production line, productivity, and kind of Industrial Revolution era thinking.
Well, I think we're fortunate to be in a city which I think takes a lot of cues from what you just said. It truly is, I suppose, a responsive city, and it has considered nature as almost a fundamental building block for a city and not an afterthought. And I wonder if you have got any thoughts on Singapore versus Dubai versus the Bay Area. I know you've spent a lot of time, and you still do. You have businesses in all of these cities and probably many more innovation hotspots. Can you offer us a perspective about what you see in these places, what is different, and what may be an opportunity to learn from one another?
Well, I think, when I'm talking about focus on human outcomes, Lee Kuan Yew, when Singapore was forming, it was very difficult to rationalize planting 10,000 trees a year. If you look at the economics, you look at all the places that you could be focusing on growing a nation, the idea that you're putting 10,000 trees in the ground every year as a recognition toward creating a more lovable, more comfortable city, I think that's something that most leaders overlook. They'll look at the functional criteria, but very few will look at what it means to create something that will connect people to a place in a much deeper way. And I'm sure when they had the discussion with the accountants, they weren't recommending planting those trees. I'm sure they could have spent the money elsewhere. But he recognized the true value of making Singapore a garden city as opposed to another, urban kind of concrete jungle. And I think that livability aspect is the part that we have to elevate in every city fundamentally during this time, because people, in order to attract people who've moved away, you're going to have to offer something better. And isolated zoning as a strategy, I think, has sort of served its purpose, and it's time to move past that.
I'm going to come back to perhaps your experiences in the other locations, but what you said there made me think of a phrase, eco-capitalism. I think when you say you can't account for the value of something as fundamental as nature, there's got to be something, I think, missing in the way we're doing things. And in your experience, you've worked with businesses, you've worked with cities, you've worked with individuals who have been visionary in a way that no one else has. Do you really see that there's an opportunity for us now to reinvent, rethink capitalism in the context of cities? Do we almost need to do that? And do you think eco-capitalism has a future?
Well, I would say I don't think anything is sacred. If you're looking at solving a new design problem, to hang on to old ideas and assume that you're going to repurpose them into the future is probably naive. If you look at the cost of having a society that focuses on sustainable building, for example, when Gavin Newsom was mayor of San Francisco, he set up a policy where all the developers who were meeting certain ecological standards in the construction and operation of their buildings, they got to move to the front of the line on the approval process. And so it didn't cost the city a thing. They just moved people forward in the line who were having a positive contribution to the urban environment, and the ones who chose not to invest in that didn't have that opportunity. So there are ways in the planning and the operation of city policy that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a negative cost. I think it's a bit of a fallacy to think that the economic burden of creating cities that ignore sustainable practices, I think it's just it's just too short-sighted.
Agreed. In fact, that makes me think a little bit about who are the people behind cities and who's thinking about them, who's actually planning for them, who's actually implementing the changes that we need to in a complex ecosystem. And I wonder if I can turn the discussion a little bit to maybe the education side of things. And listening to you when you say redesign, design, reform cities, these are, I think, difficult things to do at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. So I almost wonder, do you need a city designer? I know that we have urban designers and urban planners, and you have designers, and you have people who do contribute to the making of cities who come from the world of business and so on. But do you need a combination of some of that, almost like a composite character called a city designer, to bring it all together? Is there a need for that sort of a job? And do you see a job? I mean, you design all sorts of things.
Well, I think what it relates to naturally is we've historically looked at cities as infrastructure. We're going to create buildings, we're going to create roads, and water and sewer and these systems that support the functional aspect of it. But the feasibility and success of cities is not just built on the functional side, but it has to be looked at from the aspirational side as well. And I think what they need are experienced designers, somebody who creates elements of the city that reinforce the culture and the experience that people have there. And I think that needs to be woven into the planning decisions. If you're looking at creating successful human outcomes, and that's not even in the conversation, if you do, it's by accident, right? So I think there has to be more intent and more thought given to what are the human outcomes.
And so that's interesting. I know when an idea becomes mature or comes to the point where there's acceptability in general, I think design certainly has reached that stage over the last decade or so. And when it hits that sort of a mark, you usually see organizations or even cities respond organizationally by saying, oh, we'll have a chief X officer. And I know that perhaps there is evidence now that we do have chief design officers, but does it require someone within the executive teams, whether in City Hall or in corporations, or is it more of a distributed discipline? Does everybody need to have a sort of a minimum understanding of design almost to be able to contribute, so that you're not really challenging design as a paradigm, but it's much more than about how do you actually get this into in the real world?
Yeah. Well, I think there's probably two parts to that. One is, it does not hurt that people are taught creative processes, design thinking, these types of things in all aspects of life. It helps you regardless of whether you're ultimately a designer or an architect or something like this. Relative to the city planning, we work with companies in all over the world. There's a trend more and more to engaging an experience master plan. So rather than just a physical master plan, to also create an experience master plan. And this talks about how people interact. It talks about how people flow through the city. Rather than it being purely a functional component, it's recognizing that to make a successful ecosystem, you have to ask these questions and be able to deal with the different aspects of a city that have to be supported from the human perspective. And I think that we tend to get now more and more companies who are becoming aware of that, which means that the cities will become more aware ultimately.
That's really intriguing, an experience master plan. Have you, and perhaps you can't talk about it, but are you finding a demand for that sort of a thing? I would imagine that certainly it's something that you're recommending organizations to do, but have you found any enlightened companies or cities who have demanded or asked for an experience master plan?
So this is our 23rd year working with Apple. When you think about the experience you have with Apple, say any touch point with the company, it's made up of really 4 different parts. It's the environment that the company creates, it's the products and services, the behavior, and the forms of communication. We take those 4 elements and recognize that to have any successful relationship, you need to have the values of the people you're trying to connect with and the values that you represent have some alignment. And so the touch points that you create within that experience come from those 4 categories. But we started doing that in retail because this is the way you communicate your values to get people to engage with your company, to buy your products and services. That then transmitted into all other sectors, into automotive. It's going now into large-scale master plans of physical sites, some of the largest projects in the world right now we're working on. And that experience master plan has become the parallel to the feasibility, the physical master plan. So while you do have roads and buildings and things, well, what happens when you build those? How do you model those? What are the impacts? How are you creating value? And it's not just economic value. Certainly the developers we work with are looking for economic returns on their investment, but it's also a much better product if the people who live there become your advocates. And so what we're looking to do is to create that form of advocacy through the experience.
Let me actually turn attention to something you said in the presentation, which really was quite an intriguing idea. You said we need a new operating system. And your proposition was one of dynamic stability. It's almost sort of counterintuitive.
Oxymoron, yeah.
Yes. Do you have any candidate cities? You've traveled the world. Do you think there are cities that can potentially absorb that idea and take that on, a city-level operating system? That's quite amazing as a thought.
So I think that there's something about dynamic stability that recognizes an organic condition rather than a static condition. We tend to want to create static conditions and then hope that everything stays that way for as long as possible. It's fundamentally unrealistic. And so the idea that's the idea of stasis isn't something that's fundamentally found in nature. Then we need to think about how do we design ways in which we can react, respond, transform, and change, and recognize that flexibility shouldn't be terrifying. It should be built into the OS that we have so that we then know how to operate within it. And I think that's probably, the idea of dynamic stability. When Thomas Friedman talks about it, he talks about the most successful communities are very small scale communities. And I think it's fair to say that large scale entities, whether they're corporations or nations, empires, they all have a struggle at a certain scale. And I think scale starts to be an important factor. So when you get, the idea of a mega city, the idea of a mega government, any of these things that become so large scale and so dominant tend to struggle, and they start to break into parts. So what he looks at is, if you look at small communities where your fire department, your police departments, your community colleges, these smaller scale elements actually tend to have greater tolerance and more successful interactions in general. Less division, less opportunity for division to be created. So I think part of that is looking at the scale of what you're creating and really building on this kind of cellular idea.
And yet we keep pursuing scale at levels which we know are not sustainable.
We should have learned something, I think.
And I almost wonder if there's almost something therefore that needs to be educated within humanity generally, or perhaps leadership of cities and companies, that you need that level of distribution and decentralization to really succeed. Are you seeing any evidence of that? We're in the middle of a pandemic. Is there anything that you've seen right now happen? Is there a pattern you're seeing of cities or countries that are responding better to COVID than others? Is there something there?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think there are obviously people who have different opinions about what to do in this situation. The facts are there. Anyone can look at them as to what is a successful approach and what has been a failed approach. I think when you look at any of these problems we encounter, whether it's COVID or other things, we have to recognize we're in a continuous learning condition. And this idea of dynamic stability, the notion that you're continually learning, just because you went through an education program and you've graduated and you've been honored as having been complete, you just start to learn. And I think we all have to have the humility to learn every day from these things and be able to adopt and adapt and recognize we have to have that flexibility. So I think, there's pockets where you see that. You see it in certain companies that are coming up. You see it in different places. I had a group approach me to ask, have we ever thought about designing a government, which I had never thought about. But again, you're looking at designing complex ecosystems that need to work together, and what are the types of policies and frameworks that can lead to that. So, I think there are lots of examples, and I think the people who recognize we're continually learning are the ones, are going to make the steps forward.
Designing a government. Now that's a project that would be interesting. Can you share something about that? Have you already begun work on it?
No, we haven't begun.
I think a few governments might sign up for that program.
No. It's a very small government, but they're faced with some unique conditions, and these unique conditions haven't been there throughout the history of their existence, and so recognizing that they have to change. It's the demographics and the environment and the economic models. All of these things have to change. What can they do to be successful from that with the resources they have? And so you're looking at an entirely new group of people who need to become a collective in some form in order to support each other. But to me, it's a fascinating problem. It's the kind of problem that we have, whether we're looking at a university system or a city, a company. We see this a lot in there's familiar patterns that are forming around the challenges that people are encountering today, and a lot of the solutions are actually coming back around the same thing.
I'm going to turn our attention to something we've obviously been talking, experience, recurring theme. Mm-hmm. The festival has probably got people tuning in from all over the world. Mm-hmm. I suspect there are a lot of young people, and I would love to hear a few of your thoughts about how they can learn from the experience you've had over the years. What is your advice to them? A lot of students are experiencing, and parents are experiencing for the first time, this whole idea of home-based learning. It's also forcing universities and schools to adapt and rethink how learning happens. You talked about continuous learning. I think we all have to really admit to ourselves that learning is not just happens when you're in school or university. So I wonder if you have any messages for this moment in time for people who are, of course, young and learning, but also adult learners, and what is your advice to them from a design perspective?
Well, I think the notion that you're always learning makes you less afraid of change. And if we're going to go through a period of rapid change, it's important to get a mindset that's going to work for the most people. And I think that idea that what you thought you knew yesterday may change tomorrow, that's good, it's healthy, there's nothing wrong with that. I know in working with different universities and institutions, education is going through a radical rethink of how they remain relevant. You know, today we have no shortage of access to information, but what we do lack is wisdom. And so having information in and of itself isn't enough to be educated, right? And so I think just that the notion of the old way of thinking about our education system is fundamentally going to have to transform, and in ways that make use of some of the opportunities and access to information that we have, so that we have a way of filtering it. We have a way of taking it in and having it be helpful, you know, to each one of us in different ways. And you know, I guess one of the biggest changes that I can imagine with respect to education is the notion of having this perpetual kind of insight. And there are companies working on this technology, but to have that be a part of you know, your daily existence. So it's different than just a mobile phone, but having that access to not just information, but contextualized wisdom is something that's potentially super valuable.
Well, you know, they say that you can spend an entire lifetime and not end up having you know, wisdom, but a lot of knowledge. So that's a great thought. We're kind of reaching the end of this conversation, so I do want to talk a little bit about 8, because that's been your labor of love for over 2 decades now, and you've built a very unique model. And combining it with our, you know, the last question, do you see in the future an 8 university? Do you see a way that you can transmit all of these wonderful experiences that you've learned, your team has learned, the clients who you've worked with? There must be a treasure trove of knowledge there. And obviously you're not done yet, so you're obviously still building out the business. What's the future of 8 look like? And, you know, talk to us more generally about that, but also do tell us if there's an 8 university we could look forward to.
There's not an 8 university in the pipeline yet. You know, I have a book coming out next month, so that's the closest thing to.
So that's return to experience.
Return on experience.
Return on experience.
Yeah, that's the closest thing to sharing some of those years of experimentation. In the presentation, I talked about the belief of our business is really shared by a number of people who think that design can define human progress. That's all of our objectives. And so that shared objective is a really good jumping off point for the work that we're doing. We still have to deliver and you know, produce solutions for problems for people. But you know, when it comes to the idea of it being a continuous learning environment, I see more of what we're doing as an experiment, part of a larger conversation about how design can impact society, how thoughtful, critical thinking can be valuable, having empathy for one another and recognizing we need to take care of each other. These things are all important in the foundation, and then that allows you the greatest opportunity to build on something that has impact.
And I guess final question really that I would ask, this is, we're sitting in Singapore at the beautiful gardens by the bay at a time when, of course, most of the world can't even go out, perhaps, or if they are going out, they're doing so at high risk. So the world has, of course, fundamentally shifted, and experience is, perhaps events are one way of, one form of experience, which I think we're going to see less and less of. But again, given your vantage point, You worked with retail. People love thronging in shopping malls. Do you see the reinvention of the shopping mall, the public spaces, events? Obviously, an experience master plan is much more than the sum of those things, but those are some of the critical anchors. So what is the future of events? What's the future of retail look like? Perhaps you can share a few minutes on that.
There's a lot of questions in that. I mean, the future of retail simply is this relationship, I think, between the physical and the virtual spaces that we've created. I don't think there's one or the other. The polarity, which is kind of a false polarity that was created, was really not looking at the way young people today, digital natives, they don't find technology that unique. It's like oxygen. They only care if they don't have it. It's just always there, and it's ubiquitous. So that kind of polarity, which my generation went through, it's kind of an old idea. And I think that when you look at the transformations that COVID has had on group activities, Singapore and other countries have done a great job at recognizing that we do everything we can to mitigate the risk of exposure to the virus, mitigate the deaths that can come from it. And if we do so, we have a chance to get back to a more successful engagement that includes group activities and other interactions. But it's one of those things where if you don't have everybody playing from the same playbook, then you're going to end up with that being extended, that condition being extended. So, I think the Singapore government here has done a great job at defining what are the best ways to contain it, and have used those practices and have seen results. So I don't think it's the end of urban spaces, of public spaces, but I do think it's a great opportunity to change those spaces and to change those experiences. And we need to recognize we are in a, there may be COVID-20, there may be the next one, right? So how we understand and how we interact will need to be considered now as part of anything that we design or create.
Thank you so much for a lovely conversation and a brilliant presentation, and congratulations on the book. We look out for that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Tim.
Thanks, Anupam. Thank you.